it's your boy Corey the man. We back in it. We ready to get right into this video. This is Peter was nerfed, and I have proof. Let's see what they're talking about. Let's get right into it. Here we go.
One of the biggest criticisms of Spider-Man 2 since launch was that Peter Parker was nerfed. What does this mean? Well, it simply means that he was weaker and more incompetent in Spider-Man 2 compared to Spider-Man 1 and Miles Morales. Some moments like the infamous fridge scene have become a symbol of this nerf. But the bigger question I want to answer is this criticism actually true? The answer is yes. Well, no, but yeah, sorta. It's complicated. So I want to take some time to look over Peter's performance over the first and second game and see if he really was nerfed, and more importantly, how. I think there are three ways to analyze how and why Peter might have been nerfed. There's the narrative sense, which is how often he justifiably loses, and then we can look at how Peter is thematically nerfed, looking at how he operates in the context of other characters, and finally, the time sense, where we can view how much Peter is nerfed in the context of screen time. Before we get started, we have to make something clear. People often say Peter was nerfed, but what they actually mean is that Spider-Man was nerfed. We say Peter so people don't assume we're talking about Miles, but we're talking about Peter's Spider-Man. For the sake of this video, we'll refer to Spider-Man purely in terms of Peter Parker's heroic persona, and we will only refer to Miles by the name Miles. This isn't because Miles isn't Spider-Man, okay? I'm not a freak, it's just for simplicity. Also, this video was actually supposed to go on my second channel, That Guy Aqua, but it's going here so you guys can hear about said second channel. I've been covering superhero topics, mostly relating to Spider-Man and Batman, posting every Monday, and I hope to see you guys over there. Without further ado, let's see if Peter was actually nerfed. When I began researching for this video, my first step was to replay the game and look at all the times Peter loses. I then tried to categorize how he lost and if it was justified. A justifiable loss is considered as a moment where he does not feel, in the moment, nerfed as a means of giving the story stakes. For example, when he loses to the Sinister Six, that's totally justifiable. He's surrounded, taking a 1v5, and while he holds his own for a bit, it makes perfect sense that he loses here. An unjustified loss is when in the burning building with May. Peter's strength is suddenly so weak that he virtually passes out as he falls into a burning building where, had Miles not caught him, he would have been burned alive. This to me is an unjustified loss, where his strength, dexterity, and durability have been altered to give a moment stakes and push the idea that Spider-Man needs to rely on his friends. This is a common issue we see in plenty of superhero stories, and when it comes to Spider-Man, the biggest barrel of fish you can open is the spider sense. The moment you introduce his ability to sense and react to danger that he can't directly see, we open all kinds of possibilities for Peter to just have his senses nerfed because the villain needs to get the drop on him. I don't think this narrative issue is a big deal if it's done sparingly, and as long as it isn't too egregious. For example, when Otto defeats Peter with relative ease in their first encounter, he is able to, quite quickly, turn around and face him again, except this time defeat him, despite already being weakened. Where it becomes egregious is when he's shown to be defeated by unjustified reasons. To look at another example, we can see that Peter is able to take down both Rhino and Scorpion at the same time in the first game. However, in Miles Morales, Peter is soloed by Rhino to the point where, had Miles not been there, he would have died. Now, they do this so that Miles has a reason to step up and be pushed enough to unlock his Venom powers, but it makes no sense that Peter would be so easily battered by the Rhino like this. So with that in mind, let's look at all the ways Peter loses in the first game. The first instance of Peter losing is when he is knocked out at City Hall. This is a perfectly justifiable way for him to lose. He wasn't prepared, did what he could, and ultimately wouldn't have been able to stop the bombing anyways. Another is when first coming face to face with Lee, where Spider-Man is pinned under a server rack after taking a direct blow. He didn't know about Lee's powers or how they worked, and the server rack was probably pretty heavy. I'd say justified. When Sable shows up, she traps Peter and he can't break out, even though he does that plenty in gameplay. I would say this is pretty unjustified, and is done to make Sable seem like a threat. He also loses to her again later in the game. The next time is one against the Sinister Six. As mentioned, this is a perfectly fine reason to lose. Another instance is the burning building, and I believe it is unjustified. Spider-Man should have been able to get out of that. The next is one against Scorpion. This might seem unjustified because he loses without much effort, but it's explained that Scorpion is using a new serum developed by Otto, so it makes sense that the effects of it catch him off guard, so I consider this justified. Finally, he loses to Otto after his transformation, and as mentioned, this is justified. In total, Peter loses about 8 times throughout the story, and 5 of those times it is justified, leaving 3 instances where I believe Peter's power was capped in order to build up the story's antagonists. I'd say this is a very forgivable amount. We can see again that he loses to Rhino and Miles Morales, and while I won't count this game because Peter is hardly in it, I want to examine this scene because it highlights a big part of the problem, which is Insomniac will sometimes not remember that Peter needs to lose for a reason. If he lost to Rhino because Miles interfered and accidentally sabotaged him, then it wouldn't feel like Peter is just being nerfed to fit the narrative. Anyways, let's move on to Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 2 introduces a bit of a problem with our current methodology, which is that sometimes Peter can technically lose and win at the same time. And this comes up in the game's very introduction. When fighting Sandman, Peter falls into some sand and has technically lost. He is saved by Miles, and without Miles, would have presumably suffocated. However, later in the fight, they win because Peter devises a plan using Miles' electricity, so he technically wins there, as without him, Miles would have lost. Again, in both cases, these scenes are written to highlight the benefit of having two heroes. In these niche cases, we will count it as both a win and a loss and keep it neutral. The next time we see Peter lose is at the amusement park, where he nearly fails to save a roller coaster of civilians before Harry shows up to save the day. Peter has lifted much heavier, so again, this is done to make Harry's entrance more dramatic. The next scene is one I'm conflicted on, and of course, it's where Peter is stabbed. Peter needs to lose to Kraven so the narrative that he needs the suit can continue, but in this case, it would have been nice to see him put up more of a fight. I want to leave the scene neutral, because I don't think he was nerfed in this scene, but less so hardly allowed to participate. Similar sentiment to the church scene. Sure, Kraven does initially get one over by ringing the bell, but Peter does destroy it, so if there was to be a fight, Kraven would have likely gotten his shit rocked. Regardless, not counting it as a victory and leaving it neutral. The next time we see Peter lose is when we lose the symbiote suit. Once he has the suit, he goes on a tear through the rogues gallery and doesn't lose, but he does lose to Miles. I love this scene and I love this fight, but again, Kraven is the strongest villain the two have faced, and Peter needed the symbiote to win, and Miles just beat the symbiote, so what does that imply? Either way, Peter is ultimately the one to take the suit off, and it's a justified loss, so let's put a pin in that for now because Peter loses once again against Venom. He's thrown through a wall and is knocked out for the entire night. I consider this, even if it is a minor infraction, an unjustified loss, and it's done so we can have the coolest level in the game. I wish the game justified it by claiming that after taking off the suit, the fatigue caught up with him all at once, but we don't really get that, so unjustified. Now we arrive at the main attraction, the fridge scene. Oh man, where do we begin? Okay, so I understand that a fridge is deceptively heavy, easily around 300 pounds, but I think the problem with this scene is that Peter is wholly off his game, and let's break it down. For starters, I don't think it was irrational for MJ to jump in front of Peter. She loves him, but it does come across as her having faster reaction time than him. Then, Peter's head hit the fridge, then the floor, then the fridge again, and I'll admit, that's brutal. Worse, however, is Peter then gets up when MJ is taken and stares at Venom while she is literally being suffocated by the symbiote. Listen to this! Don't. All he says is, don't. Like, bro, fucking do something! What are you saying? Part of what frustrates me with this scene is that it's an unjustified loss, and it would be so easy to make it justified while maintaining the core of the scene. We can keep MJ jumping in front of Peter. Some consider it stupid of her, but again, it's natural when you love someone. And it's not like MJ isn't already in direct danger by simply being the only non-superpowered person in the house. Instead, however, Peter can push her out of the way, causing the tendril to not hit him, but grab him. The tendril can wrap around his neck, and then while virtually subdued, Venom uses the other arm to drag MJ away. Then he can keep his plea for Harry to not do it and not look like a bum for just standing there watching. Regardless, this is an unjustified loss. There's plenty of ways to justify it if we bring in outside information or make significant assumptions, but in a vacuum, this is a near undeniable unjustified loss. The next loss is at City Hall, and it's once again due to the general incompetence on the part of both Spider-Men. Peter puts up hardly any fight against the infected, and conveniently has no sound gadgets, which are canon as they were developed as part of a different earlier mission. Then Miles jumps in, and instead of using electricity or anything really, he just tugs on him a bunch. Now, granted, we can see multiple tendrils begin to pin Peter down as soon as he hits the ground, so it's hard to call this entirely unjustified, so we can simply leave it as neutral, as once again, it's to make Mr. Negative the hero. When Peter encounters Harry again, he, despite having Venom, hardly puts up a fight again. Perhaps this is because he is clearly still conflicted over having to fight his friend, but the entire plan of entering his base and basically forcing himself to be saved by Miles was completely foolish, and seemed a contrivance so Peter knows where the meteorite is. Unjustified loss. Finally, Peter in his final encounter has the effects of Anti-Venom change moment to moment. Now, this makes some sense from a writing perspective because Anti-Venom is the most blatant plot device ever, but especially in the case of when Venom defeats him after his second phase, he hardly resists him. What could he do to escape? Maybe the thing he did not even a minute ago when he was in the exact same situation. Again, this could easily be changed to have Venom stop the fight midway because he senses that the meteorite is gone, and Peter can struggle to keep up with him because he just flies away. Unjustified loss. Also, we know Anti-Venom is strong enough to do this, so it feels like the capabilities of Anti-Venom are all over the place. Our final total is 7 unjustified losses and 2 justified losses. That is significantly more than the first game. However, I don't think this is the whole picture, because if it was, we'd see similar complaints to a smaller extent with the first game, but we don't. In order to determine another aspect of how Spider-Man feels nerfed, we can shift away from the narrative and look at the actual gameplay, because a significant amount of time is spent as Peter, even when we have Miles alongside us, but significantly less time is spent as Spider-Man. The following argument is going to require quite the helping of salt, because when we factor in numbers for gameplay, we run into the issue of variability. What if my playthrough looked a little different than yours, and what if I spent more time on X than Y? So consider these rough estimates, and as you'll see, the grain of salt won't affect the outcome very much. The way we are going to evaluate a playthrough is by how much time is spent as Spider-Man and how much time is spent as Peter or another character that isn't Spider-Man. In the first game, we can see my 8-hour and 25-minute playthrough. We have 5 hours and 38 minutes under the mask, and the rest, 2 hours and 38 minutes, is spent as a normal human. That means 65% of the game is spent as Spider-Man. Let's compare this to Spider-Man 2. For this game, we'll be counting gameplay as Miles as non-Spider-Man gameplay, because a lot of the sentiment that Peter was nerfed is heightened by people feeling like Miles was forced down their throat. Also, a minor stipulation, I am considering the small segment where you go undercover in Kraven's house as a Spider-Man segment, because it is directly tied to Spider-Man's goal and is meant to show off the Black Suit's capabilities. Here are what the numbers come out to. The entire story took me about 9 hours and 50 minutes. Of that time, 5 hours, just barely over half, was spent as Spider-Man. 1 hour and 10 minutes was spent as Peter, 30 minutes was spent as Mary Jane, a surprisingly small amount of time, and 2 hours and 50 minutes was spent as Miles. This means that 52%, or otherwise half of the game, is spent playing as someone who is not Peter Parker's Spider-Man. Now granted, I didn't include the Venom mission in the statistics because I don't really think anyone had a problem with it. In fact, despite the mission only being 15 minutes, it's probably still the highlight of the game. That is still an absurd number. I think it's interesting that despite the narrative otherwise, we actually spend far less time as non-powered humans in this game than we did in the first game, but that's not exactly the point. Many people have issues with how much time is spent as Miles or MJ, and they aren't exactly wrong in those issues. Side note, just thought it was interesting, we spend a total of 1 hour and 45 minutes in the Black Suit. That is not good. So, what's the conclusion then? Peter was nerfed? I mean, narratively, he's losing much more and for shakier reasons, and he is less present in this game than he was in his debut. But something doesn't sit right with me. There's something about what we've covered that still doesn't present Insomniac as an entity hell-bent on minimizing Peter. Of course, you see the runtime, we have a bit more to cover, and no video essay is complete without a good twist.
What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity buck bumble.
While I was taking my time going through the first 2 games, I figured why not do the same calculations for Miles and see where he stacks up. The Miles Morales game took about 4 hours and 22 minutes to complete, with about 53 of those minutes being outside of the mask, and 3.5 hours under. That means 83% of the game is under the mask, the highest density of Spider-Manning so far. More interesting, however, is how and when Miles loses. Miles is a total newbie in this game, which makes a lot of his incompetence justified. Mostly. He loses to Finn after chasing her, and this is a weird loss because while he could melt her tools with his electricity, as showcased on the bridge, he might be hesitant because that's his friend. Then he justifiably loses to Rhino because he is ambushed, outnumbered, and he has new armor that negates his electricity powers. Then he loses to Finn again in the subway tunnel, though he's not really putting up a fight, instead trying to reason with her. And that's it. Miles doesn't lose often, and 2 out of the 3 times he does, you can make a reasonable argument that he wasn't even trying to win. Spider-Man 2 is a different story. Miles would have been eaten by Sandman, but is saved by Peter, much in the same way Peter saved him. Miles loses instantly to Scorpion, much in the same way that Peter did in the first game. You could say Miles fails to catch Lee in this scene, but it was a joint effort and Peter made the call to let him go, so I don't count this one. He loses when captured by the Hunters, and I think this is pretty justified. He loses when trying to save Peter in possibly the greatest display of incompetence, and finally, he loses to Venom, or would have lost if he wasn't saved by MJ. So he loses 5 times, and only once is it justified. He still loses less than Peter, but he doesn't have as much screen time. So what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, I'd say Insomniac didn't necessarily nerf Peter, they nerfed the writers. Despite a lot of the core directorial team remaining consistent across the three games, all three Spider-Man games have had mostly different writers. This is why the games vary so widely, not just in terms of writing quality, but writing quirks. However, there is one quirk that seems to permeate through a lot of the games, and that's the way they present power. Insomniac never makes a character powerful through giving them strength. Instead, they make the protagonist weak. That's why Miles' electricity can sometimes melt metal away when it's convenient and suddenly do nothing when it isn't. It's why Kraven kills half the Sinister Six off screen, and why we see him kill Scorpion. It shows the player that he's a real threat, and when we want to make Venom look like a threat, he kills Kraven and makes Peter look like a bitch. It's not exclusive to Peter either. Scorpion is mogged, Vulture is deathmaxing off screen, and even Kraven is conveniently spared in his first encounter with symbiote Peter. I think a lot of this comes down to the writing process where writers say, okay, we need Peter to be in X position so that Y can happen. But little consideration is given to if it makes sense for how the character gets in that spot. When it comes to why there is so much non-Spider-Man gameplay, I simply think it has to do with Brian Intihar as a director. Peter Parker is literally half the reason Spider-Man is so cool, and Brian Intihar has always maintained that he wants to showcase that side of him, specifically because they are two sides of the same coin. This isn't a bad thing necessarily, but it is still at the core of the stories Intihar wants to tell. There's a particular interview clip that comes up a lot in these conversations where he says he will double down on the MJ missions.
The MJ missions. Where do I begin? I heard all the feedback, and I will tell you, I felt like it was a cop-out if we didn't have them.
Yeah.
I felt like we were saying, okay, yep, everybody just wants to see Spider-Man and whatever. Like, who cares about the perspective of seeing the world from a non-superhero standpoint? I was like, whatever. And I said, no, we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it. We're gonna look at the criticisms and see what we can do right. And I think that it was really important to show that she is a capable hero in her own way.
For sure.
Give people stuff you know they want, so you can inject things that maybe they aren't familiar with, or maybe they don't know they want, but make them like that stuff.
It's hard to not feel put off by this, and while I do think the reaction to this has been overblown, I certainly don't think he's saying fuck the fans, and rather saying, I hear you, we will do them again, but this time better. And when it came to MJ, they were better, but I still think this is indicative of how he directs, and Spider-Man Miles Morales supports this. That game had the least amount of screen time featuring a character outside of the suit, and conveniently, Intihar didn't direct that one. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, because eventually this will just turn into a story critique, and I don't want this to seem like I'm hating, okay? I still consider Brian Intihar to be video game Jesus Christ, and Insomniac as a whole goats for finally giving us a great Spider-Man game, but I want to clarify a few things as we wrap up. I don't believe Peter himself was maliciously nerfed. I don't think the people that do think that are wrong. In fact, all evidence points to them being somewhat right. But I personally, in my heart of hearts, don't get that impression. I know the discourse around these games can get heated at times, and I want to say that all of these games, especially Spider-Man 2, are flawed and are worthy of critiquing, but I still love them dearly. I play Spider-Man 2 a few times a week. I love just swinging around, enjoying the vibes, and poor writing or inconsistencies don't change that. While I now believe that Peter was in some ways nerfed, I don't think it was in service of Miles. Yes, Miles suffers from the writing issues less than Peter, especially in his own game, but I think we got here due to a combination of this being a primarily Peter-driven story, and Insomniac wanting to show how awesome it is to have two Spider-Men. I can't prove it, obviously, but I do believe that it's meant to say, look how much more they can do, instead of, look how useless one is without the other. I think it's unfortunate that a lot of bad actors have really hopped on the trend of saying Peter was nerfed, because ultimately, I think it leads to a lot of bad faith criticism, and it paves the way for hundreds of assumptions that make engaging with the game's discourse toxic and unenjoyable. But unfortunately, even if some of the people who believe this can be jackasses, in this particular case, they're also correct. Once again, feel free to check out the second channel for more Spider-Man and Batman content. Thank you to our patrons for supporting this channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
Thank y'all for watching. I'm gonna try to get one more video out. I'm gonna try to do 4. I gotta be somewhere, but you know, we'll try our best.